The alarm did not build to a crescendo. It did not climb politely through warning tones before arriving at something urgent. It simply arrived. One flat, hard note, cut through the Varath Station Council chamber, the way a blade cuts through still water, and every delegate in that room went rigid at exactly the same moment. Kale Morrow did not go rigid. He had been awake for 19 hours. He had been on this station for 11 years. He had been sitting in this specific chair, at this specific angle, in this corner of a room that had never entirely decided what to do with him, for long enough that the alarm felt less like a warning and more like a thing he had been waiting for, without ever admitting he was waiting for it. He lifted his coffee cup. The coffee was terrible, as it had always been terrible. Brewed from compressed protein and synthetic bean oil that smelled vaguely of old ambition and tasted like someone had described coffee to a machine that had never tasted coffee. And the machine had done its sincere and misguided best. He drank it anyway. Some habits you keep not because they serve you but because they tether you to something real, some version of yourself that existed before the chair in the corner, and the advisory title, and the 11 years of being tolerated. The main display wall of the council chamber went white, then resolved into a sensor overlay of the space beyond the station's outer marker buoys. 12 delegate species turned their various arrays of eyes and sensory organs toward it. The Varath delegate, Counselor Aelith, leaned forward in her ceremonial bone-white plate armor and touched the data stream with 2 long fingers, spreading it wide across the display, in the gesture of someone reading a situation, rather than just looking at one. She had been on this council for longer than most species measured their political careers. She did not startle easily. The way her secondary eyelids stayed absolutely still told Kale that she had already understood what she was looking at, and was now doing the harder work of deciding what to do about having understood it. The object in the display was a ship. One ship. It had dropped from faster-than-light transit approximately 40 seconds earlier, at a distance of roughly 800 kilometers from the station's outer ring. Its profile was compact by the Galactic Council's measurement conventions, a mid-range warship class, about 400 meters from bow to stern, running lights active, all navigation beacons broadcasting openly. Its transponder was transmitting a clean registration signal, no encryption, no attempt at concealment. Its weapons arrays were folded and completely dark, not in standby mode, not charged and waiting, completely, genuinely, unpowered. The transponder signal resolved into text on the upper portion of the display. United Earthship Antietam, registry number, departure point, flight plan, all of it filed in advance through the correct channels, all of it legal, all of it correct to the last decimal point. Kale read the name. He read it the way you read something you have been expecting without knowing precisely when it would arrive, and then he set down his coffee. Counselor Aelith said, in the trade language that the chamber shared across all its member species, Ambassador Morrow, the human vessel. Is this expected? No, Kale said. That was the truth. He had not known the Antietam was coming. He had not been warned or briefed. He had not received so much as a compressed data burst in the past 96 hours to suggest that anything was about to change. What he had was a name that meant something specific to anyone who had spent time in the Kepler corridor between 2187 and 2194, and meant almost nothing at all to anyone who had not. The vessel is presenting as non-aggressive, said the Prethian delegate, Counselor Sath. His crest feathers were held flat against his skull in the configuration Kale had learned. Over 11 years of close attention, meant cautious and watching, but not yet afraid. Weapons offline, drive-in cooldown, standard post-transit behavior. Weapons offline, Counselor Aelith repeated. She said it in a tone that made it sound like a question, even though it was not phrased as one, because it was unusual. Ships arriving at Varath Station, a Galactic Council installation, the most politically significant structure in this entire sector, typically arrived with weapons in active standby mode, charged, aimed at nothing, but powered and ready, not because anyone expected to fire, because it was the honest, visible acknowledgement that you were a warship, that you were present, and that you wanted the fact of your presence to be understood, without needing to say it aloud. The Antietam's weapons being genuinely, completely, unpowered, was not a gesture of submission. Kale had spent enough years around military people to understand exactly what it was. It was a statement of a different kind. It was the statement of someone who did not need their weapons online. He watched 3 hegemony intercept vessels, the station's outer defensive layer, break from their holding patterns and begin moving toward the Antietam. They were fast, built along the efficient lines that 600 years of hegemony naval engineering had refined into something almost elegant. Their own weapons went to active standby as they turned toward the human ship. Standard procedure. Textbook. The precisely correct thing to do when an unscheduled vessel dropped into the space near a major installation without prior authorization. "You should know something," Cale said. He had not been asked. The chamber had not turned to him. He said it anyway, to the room, and to the display wall, and to the name on the transponder signal that kept blinking its steady, patient pulse. "The Antietam's commanding officer is Elena Vasquez. Commander Elena Vasquez. She served 6 years in the Kepler corridor before the ceasefire was signed. After that, she flew 4 years of council-registered cargo runs in this sector. Every flight plan filed, every manifest submitted, every inspection passed. She is not a rogue operator." He paused. "You should also know that she has her weapons offline because she does not need them online." Counselor Aelith turned her head toward him with the deliberate slowness of someone who has decided to be very careful. "That is a strange thing to say, Ambassador." "It is," Cale agreed. He did not expand on it. He picked up his coffee. It was still terrible. He drank it. The 3 hegemony intercept ships continued their approach, accelerating through the space between the station and the Antietam, their weapons charged and their sensor arrays running full-spectrum sweeps of the human vessel. The Antietam did not maneuver. It held position. Its transponder kept singing its clean legal signal. Its running lights kept blinking their unhurried pattern. It did nothing that could be classified as evasive, or aggressive, or even particularly alert. It simply stayed where it was, in the way that very confident things stay where they are, not because they cannot move, but because moving would imply that what was approaching warranted a response. And then something else on the ship powered up. Not weapons. The station's sensor arrays registered the energy signature immediately, and the identification protocols began cycling through the hegemony's entire ship system's database, cross-referencing against every known propulsion system, every known communication array, every known sensor platform, every known defensive or offensive installation that any spacefaring species in Council records had ever put aboard a ship. The protocols came back with a result Cale could have named before the sensors finished cycling. Unknown. Not unidentified in the sense of partially matching something already cataloged. Unknown in the sense that the database had no category for what had just come online aboard the Antietam. It was not a weapons system. It was not a drive. It was not a communication array or a distress beacon or a jamming platform. The database simply had no language for what the energy signature described. The chamber went quiet. Not the ordinary quiet of a pause in proceedings. The specific quiet of a large room where many beings have simultaneously stopped making any sound at all, because the sound required to make sense of what is happening has not yet arrived. Cale looked at the energy signature blooming on the display wall. He looked at it with the particular quality of attention he reserved for things he had heard described many times, but was seeing made real for the first time. What he felt was not surprise in its pure form. It was something heavier and more complicated. The recognition that a thing you have understood intellectually for a long time has just become a fact in the physical world around you, and that the gap between understanding and witnessing is larger than you had accounted for. "Ambassador Morrow," Counselor Aelith said, with the precision of someone who is choosing their tone very deliberately. "What is that?" He thought about how to answer. He thought about Elena Vasquez and a bottle of something that a Theric merchant had sold as traditional grain beverage, and that had turned out to be considerably more traditional than either of them had prepared for. On a refueling station 11 years ago, in the early hours when the artificial dawn cycle was about to turn the porthole orange, he thought about the conversation that had lasted until that orange light arrived. He thought about what she had said, specifically, about what humans were good at, the thing that was not the obvious thing, the thing that nobody talked about, because they were always busy talking about the wars and the technology and the stubbornness. "It is the beginning of a very long letter," he said. Nobody in the chamber understood that. He had not said it for their understanding. He had said it because it was accurate, and because accuracy was, in his experience, The only thing worth saying when the situation was too large for explanation. The intercept ships reached 400 kilometers from the Antietam. The unknown system aboard the human ship pulsed. Once, a single coordinated signal, clean and precise, that the display wall registered and tried to track outward. The station's local sensor range was not sufficient. The display wall switched to long-range composite view to follow the pulse as it traveled past the outer marker buoys, past the local patrol lanes, past the limit of anything the station could directly observe, and at the edge of that range, in the dark between the stars, lights were coming on. Many lights, responding to the pulse like a city seen from above when the power returns after a long absence. One after another, and then many at once, blinking into existence across the composite map, in places that the database had logged and filed, and categorized as something else entirely. Each one small, each one unremarkable individually. Together, in the aggregate, forming a pattern that required a moment to understand, and then could not be unseen. Every delegate in the chamber was looking at the display. None of them were speaking. Cale looked too. He let the silence be what it was. He did not fill it, because it was already full, of the shape of 40 years becoming visible all at once, of the gap between the story that had been told about humanity in this room, and the story that was apparently true, of the specific and disorienting sensation of realizing that the facts had arranged themselves, without asking permission. He picked up his coffee, cold now, and still terrible. He drank it to the bottom. "Huh," he said, quietly, mostly to himself. He said it the way you say something, when the thing you have been waiting for has arrived, and is larger than the waiting, and all you have for the moment is the single honest sound of a person meeting a thing that is real. Outside the window that faced the correct direction, the window he had angled his chair to see, in the first week of his 11th year, because some arrangements matter even when no one is watching, the Antietam held its position in the dark. Running lights blinking, transponder singing, the unknown system humming with whatever it was doing, waiting with the patience of something that had been waiting for a very long time and had learned, over that time, how to make waiting into a form of preparation. The holding suite they put him in was comfortable in the specific way that reveals the exact shape of someone else's anxiety. The mattress was too soft. The temperature was set to a human comfortable range with a precision that indicated they had looked it up rather than asked. The food on the small preparation surface was real food, actual synthesized protein, not the paste compound that passed for nutrition in the council-level staff areas, and it was warm and plentiful, and accompanied by a set of beverages that included, among other options, something that smelled, almost correctly, like coffee from an actual bean. The window was large and clean and faced the interior of the station's central ring, away from the Antietam, away from the display that was currently showing the council chamber's sensor team trying to make sense of what the long-range composite had revealed. Cale moved his chair to face the other window. There was not supposed to be another window. The suite had one window, facing the interior ring, positioned so that a guest seated at the room's desk would have a pleasant view of the station's interior architecture, efficient and calming. The window on the opposite side of the room was not a window at all, but a transparent maintenance panel for the external thermal regulators, not intended to be looked through, positioned at a height and angle that would not ordinarily draw a person's attention. Cale stood on the small bench along the opposite wall and looked through it. He could see the outer ring of the station from this angle, and beyond it, at the edge of the frame, the dark. The hegemony intercept ships were just visible, 3 points of structured light, sitting completely still at 300 kilometers, which was where they had stopped. Not retreated, stopped. 3 vessels crewed by experienced tactical teams, holding position and doing nothing because nothing was what the tactical library recommended when you had found something the library did not contain. He understood that feeling. He had been in that position many times, in places the library had not covered. You stopped. You assessed. You tried to fit what you were seeing into a frame that would allow you to act without causing irreversible damage. He had not always succeeded in those moments. He had done better than the alternative would have allowed, which was not the same as doing well, but was what was available. He had been 19 years old on the garrison station at the Kepler Corridor's second transit point, when the border dispute became something worse over the course of approximately 6 hours. He had been a medical corpsman, trained for field stabilization and routine health monitoring, posted to what was supposed to be a quiet assignment, in a sector that was supposed to remain quiet for the duration of his tour. The 6 hours had required him to be a great many things he had not been trained to be. He had been those things, because the alternative to being them had costs he was not willing to pay. He had not thought of himself as brave in those 6 hours. He had thought of himself as the only person in the room, and the room had needed someone to be doing something. 4 years in the Kepler corridor. He had come out the other side with a different relationship to the concept of preparation than most people carry through their lives. Preparation, he had concluded, is the story you tell yourself before things happen. What keeps you alive in the actual event is something less organized and more honest. The willingness to see clearly, to act on what you see rather than on what you expected to see, and to trust that the next decision will become available once you have taken the current one. He sat on the bench and looked through the maintenance panel window, and drank the almost correct coffee, and thought about the Antietam out there in the dark, holding its position with weapons offline, and unknown systems humming, and he thought about Elena Vasquez on its bridge, who had spent 6 years in Kepler doing her version of what he had done, which had looked different on the surface, and pointed toward the same conclusions underneath. The holding suite door opened. A young Prethian aide came in. Cale had seen them at enough council sessions to know the face and the name. Leth, assigned to Counselor Sath's office, 3rd year in the posting. Their crest feathers were not yet at full adult coloring, and they moved through the doorway with the particular careful composure of someone carrying a script they were nervous about delivering correctly. Ambassador Morrow, Leth said, the council conveys its respects, and wishes me to inquire whether your accommodations are adequate. The coffee is almost there, Cale said. Someone did genuine research. Leth's crest shifted in the direction that meant recalibrating. The coffee comment had not been in the script. I'm glad. I'm directed to ask whether you require anything further for your comfort. Information, Cale said. Specifically what the long-range composite is currently showing in the main chamber. The full render, not the trimmed version. I'm not authorized to share sensor data from active sessions, Leth said. It was said the way things are said when they are true, but are also, clearly, not the main point of the visit. I know, Cale said. How does it look out there? Leth stood very still. Their crest went to the professional flat position. I'm also not authorized to share assessments of current deliberations. Right. Cale nodded. He looked back through the maintenance panel window. You can tell whoever sent you that I'm comfortable, and that they should stop the intercept ships from getting any closer to the Antietam. I'll relay that, Leth said. They did not move toward the door. Cale waited. Ambassador, Leth said. The formal mode of address had changed texture slightly. Less scripted, softer at its edge. What are those lights? Not quite a question. The thing underneath the question. Cale thought about how to begin. He thought about what the truth looked like from the outside, from the perspective of a being who had grown up inside the Galactic Council's institutional reality, who had been taught the Council's version of the history of human contact, who understood humanity the way the Council had always framed it, a junior species, newly spacefaring, energetic and occasionally difficult, given a managed seat at a large table in a position that allowed them to be present without being consequential. You have been charting human expansion for 4 decades, he said. Every mining claim, every colony ship, every relay buoy, every deep space research station that registered on the long-range arrays in zones the Council classified as non-priority, all of it logged, all of it filed, all of it assessed individually. He paused. None of it understood collectively. Leth's crest shifted, up, slightly, at the leading edge, the Prethian position for listening very hard to something. Those aren't mining claims, Cale said. He kept his voice level. It was important, he had learned, to say difficult things in the same tone as ordinary ones, because the tone told the listener whether they were allowed to panic or whether they needed to stay in the room and keep thinking. They're not relay buoys. They're not research stations. He held the pause for a beat. Their infrastructure, he said. The word arrived in the room and stayed there with the weight of a word that has just changed the meaning of a great many other words around it. Leth stared at him. Their crest was doing something complex. A compound motion. Several signals layering over each other in a pattern Cale did not have a complete name for. even after 11 years of studying Prethian expression. Some walls you still hit. Infrastructure for what? Leth asked. Kale looked through the maintenance panel window at the stopped intercept ships. For being here, he said. For staying. For threading through every gap between the Council's core systems and its outer colonies. Not around the Council's roots, not beside them, but through them. Integrated. Over 40 years. One quiet, unremarkable piece at a time, in places that were easy to overlook individually and impossible to understand without looking at all of them together. He let that sit, which is exactly the understanding the Council was not equipped to have, because no one was looking for it. They were looking at parts. The whole was somewhere else. Leth's expression shifted through several stages. How long has this been? 40 years, Kale said, give or take. The early installations are a little rough. The later ones are better. There's a particular cluster in the non-priority zones near the Theric outer corridors that I think was built by someone who really knew what they were doing. Took me a while to understand what it was when I found it in the archived survey data. A pause. You knew. I had a good guess, he said. There's a difference. Another pause. Longer. Ambassador, Leth said carefully. Why is it active now? Today? Why not? Because something made it necessary, Kale said. That's all I know. I haven't spoken to Commander Vasquez in 11 years. I don't have her specific calculation, but I know how she thinks, and I know she did not turn this on until she needed to, and if she needed to now, then something happened that changed what she was willing to leave invisible. He looked at Leth directly. My guess? It was the framework review that the Council voted on 8 months ago, the one that tightened the expansion corridor restrictions, the one that reclassified the outer zone surveys as requiring Council approval before human survey teams could enter. Leth's crest went to the full professional flat. Processing. Working through the implications and finding, Kale suspected, that the implications kept expanding the further they followed them. I'll relay your message about the intercept ships, Leth said finally. Thank you, Kale said. Leth left. The door closed with its soft pneumatic seal, and Kale was alone again, with the almost correct coffee, and the maintenance panel window, and the stopped intercept ships, and his thoughts, which were moving through a space that felt larger than the room around them. He thought about Elena Vasquez, at the end of a very long night on a refueling station in the outer corridor, holding a glass of something that had tasted like a mistake, and a decision at the same time. They had talked for hours, about Kepler, which was always there between them, a shared country neither of them had left entirely, even after they left it geographically, about the ceasefire and what it had produced in terms of frameworks and classifications, and the specific language that institutions use when they are managing a thing rather than engaging with it, about what came next, about what humans were actually good at, underneath all the things that people talked about when they talked about humans. She had said, patience, planning, showing up in places before anyone has decided whether to allow it, so that by the time the decision is made, the showing up is already a fact, that changing the decision would require undoing. She had said, by the time they decide to contain us, we'll already be everywhere they'd need us not to be. He had understood that. He had carried it for 11 years, turning it over like a stone in a pocket, feeling its edges on the days when the corner seat and the advisory title and the terrible coffee made everything feel permanent in the wrong way. He had thought about it every time the Council voted on a framework that tightened the brackets around human activity, every time a clause was added that required additional approval for something humans had been doing without approval, every time the language of management got a little more precise and a little more visible, and a little more honest about what it had always been. He had thought, she is watching this too. He had thought, she is counting the same things I am counting. He had thought, we agreed, that night, not to waste what we understood. She is not wasting it. He had been right. He looked through the maintenance panel window at the dark. The antetum held position, running lights blinking, transponders singing, the unknown system humming. He thought about what it had taken to build what it had built. Not the engineering, though the engineering was remarkable, and he had spent enough time with survey data to appreciate how precisely each installation had been placed, how elegantly each one served multiple functions, how the whole network was designed so that no individual component looked like anything other than what it was labeled as in the filing systems. The engineering was the visible part. What it had taken in the invisible sense was the other thing. The discipline of not turning it on when you could have turned it on. The discipline of building quietly for 4 decades without the satisfaction of anyone knowing what you were building. The discipline of choosing the moment rather than the first available moment. Of holding the patience that was not passive but active. Not the absence of wanting to act, but the practice of waiting for the action to be correct. His mother had been able to do that. He had learned it from watching her, not from being taught it, because that was the only way to learn it. She had played cards in the dark on Tuesday nights, and she had always won, not because the cards were better, or the game was unfair, but because she could wait longer than he could stand to wait, and she could wait without it looking like waiting. She had not told him to be patient. She had shown him, over and over in small games with a single candle, what patience looked like when it was real, rather than performed, and eventually the lesson had taken root, and grown into something that fit him the way learned things eventually fit, naturally, as if it had always been there. He missed her, in a specific and particular way that had nothing to do with grief, and everything to do with wanting to say, look at what we built while they were deciding what to allow. He thought she would have found it excellent. The door opened again. This time it was not Leth. Counselor Sath stood in the doorway, personally, which meant the deliberation had accelerated faster than anyone had planned for, which meant the long-range composite was showing something that had made calm Prethian patience feel like a luxury no one could afford right now. Sath's crest was fully raised, all feathers extended in a posture that had a formal name in Prethian that Kale had never encountered a reason to use in 11 years, because the situations that called for it had simply not arisen until this moment. The formal term translated, in its full connotation as, everything we thought we understood has just shifted, and we need to shift with it immediately, and you are the person who can help us understand what we are shifting toward. Kale stood. Is there any chance, he said, that someone has arranged for better coffee in the main chamber? I have been subsisting on synthetic paste for 11 years, and I think the current situation calls for an upgrade. Counselor Sath looked at him for a moment with the measured expression of a being who suspects they are being managed, and is too experienced to let it bother them, and too honest to pretend it isn't happening. I will see what can be arranged, Sath said. That's all I ask, Kale said. He followed Sath out of the holding suite and down the corridor and back toward the main chamber, where 12 species were about to have the conversation that 40 years of managed silence had been delaying, and where the display wall was going to show them, in full composite resolution, what patience had been building in the dark. He was ready. He had been ready for this conversation for 11 years. He had been ready for it, in a different sense, for most of his life. The conversation was overdue. The overdueness of it was not anger. He had made his peace with the timeline, because the timeline had been what was required to build what had been built, and what had been built was worth the timeline. The overdueness was simply true. A fact about the gap between when a conversation should have happened and when it was actually going to happen. That gap was about to close. He walked through the chamber door. The chamber was fuller than Kale had ever seen it in 11 years, and he had seen it at full attendance twice before. The previous 2 times had been significant. A territorial arbitration that ran 40 days, a species reclassification hearing he had attended on a technicality, and both times, the room had carried that particular quality of compressed attention that comes when every being present is completely, unambiguously present, with no part of their focus elsewhere. This was like that, but wound tighter. The quality of a room where something irreversible is about to be decided, and everyone can feel the irreversibility pressing in from all sides. 12 delegate species, every seat occupied. The Verath block in their ceremonial plate armor, white as chalk. The precise formal arrangement that they only used when they considered the session to be of the highest significance. The Prethian delegation in a line, crests running through more configurations than Kale could read simultaneously. The Tharic Combine at full delegation, and there it was. The thing that told him how far and fast the situation had moved. 4 representatives, in the deep green formal robes, that the Combine reserved for sessions they had decided were important enough to put their full institutional weight behind. The Tharic Combine had not spoken in open council session for 9 years. They had been present at sessions, their seats occupied, their votes cast on procedural matters, but no Tharic delegate had taken the speaking floor in 9 years. Their reasons had never been formally stated, because formally stating them would have required the kind of speech they were refusing to make. 9 years of silence, in a body that valued speech as the medium of power, and now they were here, in their formal robes, because whatever the long-range composite was showing had crossed a threshold that their 9 years of silence had been waiting for. Cale noted all of this in the 14 seconds it took him to walk from the chamber entrance to his corner seat. He filed it carefully and sat down. His coffee cup had been replaced. Actual coffee, real bean. The smell of it reaching him before he had fully settled in the chair. Someone had taken his request seriously. He picked up the cup and drank, and it was better. Still not quite right. Still missing something in the finish. But better in a way that under the current circumstances felt like a small, genuine acknowledgement of something. He looked at the display wall. The long-range composite was running at full resolution, every available sensor array contributing to the picture, and the picture at full resolution was considerably more detailed than what he had been able to see through the maintenance panel window in the holding suite. At full resolution, you could see not just the presence of the lights but their specific positions, their density, the precise way they related to the structures around them. You could see that they were not scattered randomly. You could see the intelligence in their placement, the way each one sat at exactly the junction where it would need to be if it were doing what it was in fact doing, which was threading through every significant connection between the Council's core systems and its outer territories. Not around. Through. The Prethian communication arrays that connected the Republic's 3 deep space listening posts to their central archive. The nodes were positioned in their relay corridors. The hegemony supply routes that serviced the 4 major outer installations, the nodes ran alongside and through them. The Theric Combine's colonial transit lanes, the ones that had been quietly rerouting for the past 3 years, in ways that the Combine had logged as standard optimization. The nodes were there too, integrated into the optimization so thoroughly that pulling them out would require rerouting the routes again, which would have costs the Combine would prefer not to absorb. 9 years of silence. Cale thought he was beginning to understand what the Theric Combine had been sitting with in those 9 years. Counselor Aelith called the chamber to order. Her voice had its formal authority intact, the product of long practice at maintaining the performance of control in situations that were testing it. We are here in emergency session to address the current situation in the outer approach zone and its implications for Council security. The record will reflect that all delegations are present. All delegations, including, by the record, the human advisory seat, Cale's seat. He was in the room. He had the feeling, not for the first time in 11 years but more strongly now than before, that the people who had given him this seat had not thought carefully enough about what it meant to have a human in the room when the room was having the conversation that was about to be had. Counselor Aelith summarized the situation with the precision of someone who has spent a long career making complicated things speakable in the language of formal process. An unscheduled human vessel at station approach distance, an unidentified active system aboard that vessel, a network of previously unknown human installations across 17 sectors of Council space, activated simultaneously, approximately 40 minutes ago. No hostile action from any element of the above. No communication from the human vessel other than its standard transponder broadcast. No demands, no threats, no apparent military posture. The Council is here to determine the appropriate response, she said. She looked at Cale. Ambassador Morrow, the Council will hear your statement. 11 years of advisory statements. 11 years of position papers submitted through the correct channels and received with the attentiveness the Council extended to things it had already decided about. 11 years of being the human in the room who could be present without being consequential. He thought about what to say. He thought about saying the true thing plainly, which was his preferred approach, and not always the most received one. He thought about the Theric Combine and their green robes, and what their silence for 9 years might mean about how much they had already understood, and what their presence today might mean about what they were ready to decide. He thought about the display wall, and the 40 years of patient work it was currently revealing, and what the work itself said more clearly than anything he could add to it. Commander Vasquez, he began, has been flying Council-registered space for 4 years. Before that, 6 years in the Kepler corridor. Before that, she was a person who wanted to build things, and ended up spending most of her adult life in a situation that showed her what needed to be built, and why and how, and then gave her enough time and enough room that she was able to build it. He looked at the display. What she has built is not an act of aggression. If it were an act of aggression, this conversation would already be over. She could have activated those nodes at any point in the past 4 years, with no warning, with no opportunity for this council to choose a different response, and the situation would be categorically different from what it is right now. He paused to let that land. She is giving you the opportunity to choose a different response, he said. That is what today is. That is what the Antietam sitting at 800 kilometers with its weapons offline represents. It represents an offer. The network is not leverage in the sense of a threat. It is a demonstration of a fact about the current configuration of council space that has been true for years and that the council has not previously had the information to understand. She is sharing the information. She is sharing it in a way that makes the information clear. She is doing this because something changed in the past year that made staying invisible into a different kind of cost than it had previously been. He looked at Councillor Aelith. 8 months ago, the council voted to tighten the expansion corridor restrictions and to require council approval for human survey activity in the outer zones. That vote changed the calculation. She decided it was time to have a different conversation than the one this council has been willing to have. The chamber was very still. Councillor Sath said, from the Prethian section of the table, "What conversation does Commander Vasquez want to have?" "I don't know her specific demands," Kale said. "I haven't spoken to her in 11 years. But I can read what the situation implies, if you read it honestly." He looked around the chamber. All the eyes, all the attention, all the crests and secondary membranes, and olfactory displays of 12 species, giving him the full, undivided attention that his corner seat with its advisory capacity had rarely produced. 40 years ago, this council voted on what kind of relationship it would have with humanity. The vote determined that humans would receive 1 advisory seat, no vote on security matters, limited expansion confined to pre-approved corridors, with all activity monitored and subject to review. The vote was unanimous. He let that word sit in the room for a moment. The framework was called, internally, in documents filed in the sealed archives that I have had full access to for 11 years, the containment framework. It was not called that in the public record. It was called something else in the public record, but in the sealed documents, it was called what it was. No one in the chamber spoke. The framework, he said, did not ask humans whether they agreed to it. It decided what they would be allowed to be and informed them afterward. He looked at the display wall one more time. What Commander Vasquez built out there is a 40-year answer to a 40-year question about whether the framework would define the limits of what was possible or whether something else would. He paused. It turns out it was something else. Councillor Aelith said, with the careful evenness of someone maintaining composure as a professional obligation. "What does humanity want from this council, Ambassador?" He had waited 11 years to answer this question without a qualifier, without the framing of advisory input, without the hedge of "it is my understanding that," or "the council may wish to consider that." He had waited for the moment when the answer could be heard rather than managed, and the moment was now, in a room where the display wall was showing 40 years of human patience made visible, and every delegate in the chamber was paying the kind of attention that the corner seat had never commanded. "The seat you already owed us," he said. "A real one." The chamber absorbed this. The Tharic Combine delegates exchanged a look. Brief, heavy, the kind of look that passes between people who have been waiting a long time for a specific thing to be said, and are now registering that it has been said. The Prethian delegation's crests moved in various directions, reading to Kale as a dozen individual reckonings happening simultaneously. The Varath block remained still, formally still, with the quality of stillness that is not calm but is the practiced performance of calm. Councillor Aelith said, "The council will deliberate." She did not say yes. She did not say no. She said the sentence that meant the answer had not yet been decided, which was different from the sentence that meant the answer had been decided and was being delivered with appropriate process. The difference was small and significant. Kale picked up his coffee. It was still not quite right. Better than it had been. Almost there. He drank it and waited for what came next. The motion came to a vote 3 days later. Not the motion Kale had been hoping for. Not the direct restructuring of humanity's council standing. Not the formal repudiation of the framework and the language that had underlain 40 years of managed limitation. That kind of motion required weeks of working groups and drafting sessions and the slow, grinding engagement of institutional change with its own internal resistance. He had known this walking back into the chamber. He had accepted it the way you accept weather, not because you like it, but because fighting it wastes energy that will be needed for the rest of the distance. The motion that came to a vote on the third day was an emergency authorization of force. It was worded with the care that council motions were always worded with, the care being part of their function, a way of saying a difficult thing in a frame that made it feel considered, deliberate, proportionate. The motion authorized the hegemony intercept ships currently at station approach to engage the UES Antietam if its crew did not comply with boarding and inspection protocols. It authorized a species-wide review of all human expansion activities in council space, pending treaty renegotiation. It included, buried in the third paragraph in a subordinate clause that was designed not to be the thing you noticed first, the word containment. Cale read the subordinate clause 3 times. He thought about the sealed archives. He thought about the document that had used that word 40 years ago, in a different subordinate clause, in the same kind of place where words go when they are meant to be present without being visible. He thought about how some rooms never change the shape of their decisions. They change the language. The shape stays. The chamber prepared for the formal vote. The reading of the motion was completed. Every delegation sat in the posture their species used for formal deliberation. The display wall was still showing the composite map with its network of lights, which were still active, which were still humming their integrated presence through 17 sectors of council infrastructure, because no order had been issued to disable them. Partly because the council did not know precisely how to issue such an order, and partly because disabling them would require interfering with the supply routes and communication channels they were threaded through, and the council's operational staff had already run the numbers on what that interference would cost. The numbers were not good. Councillor Aelith spoke the formal invitation. Does any delegate wish to address the motion before the vote is recorded? The room looked toward the corner. He had been in this room for 11 years. He had addressed motions before their votes many times. His addresses had been received with the attentiveness that was extended to things that were not going to change anything, which was a specific kind of attentiveness, present but unengaged, the way you listen to an alarm you have already decided not to respond to. He stood up anyway. He thought about his mother, about dark Tuesday evenings and a card game by candlelight, and what she had been teaching him by showing him rather than saying it. He thought about the specific quality of the feeling when you are in a room where a mistake is being made, and you are present for it, and you have said what you needed to say, and saying it again in a different construction is not going to change the outcome. He thought about the difference between an argument and a warning. Don't, he said. The chamber held the single word. Councillor Aelith looked at him with the expression of someone who respects the person they are dismissing. That is not an argument, Ambassador Morrow. No, he said, it's not. He sat down. He did not explain the difference. He had learned, in 11 years, that the people who needed explanations of it were not in a state to receive them, and the people who were in a state to receive them were the ones who already understood it. The Theric Combine delegates looked at him as he sat. Their expression was unreadable from across the table, but the quality of their attention was not. They were holding something, all 4 of them, something that had the weight of a decision that has not yet found its moment. The authorization transmitted. The vote moved around the chamber in its slow, inevitable tide. The Varath block first, the whole block together as they always voted, amber to red in perfect unison. The Prethian delegates in pairs, some faster than others, the variation in their timing telling Cale something about internal disagreement that the final votes would not show. The hegemony representatives with crisp efficiency, the efficiency of beings who had decided before the motion was read and were simply confirming a decision already made. The smaller delegations in sequence, amber to red, then the Theric Combine. All 4 delegates held amber. The progression of the vote, which had been moving steadily, paused around them. The chamber noticed. Every delegate who had already voted watched the 4 green-robed figures at the Combine section of the table, holding their amber lights in the formal deliberation position, which was their right. Formal deliberation could run up to 3 minutes before a delegate was required to record or abstain. 3 minutes, in the context of a chamber vote, is a very long time. 3 minutes in which 4 delegates are holding a signal that says we have not decided, while everyone else in the room is watching them, is not merely the exercise of a procedural right. It is a statement. Kale watched the 4 amber lights. He thought about 9 years of silence. He thought about what the Combine had been watching from their quiet for 9 years, what they had been calculating, what threshold they were waiting for. He thought about the network nodes in the Theric outer colonial corridors, the ones integrated into the routing optimization, the ones that pulling out would cost money and time and operational disruption that the Combine's logistics teams had clearly already modeled. 2 minutes and 40 seconds into their deliberation window, the 4 Theric lights went red. Unanimous. Counselor Aelith turned to Kale. Her courtesy was real. He had learned to distinguish real courtesy from its performed version, and this was genuine, the acknowledgement of someone who had not set out to do something unkind but was doing it anyway. Ambassador Morrow, the Council's resolution has been recorded. Do you have final words before we proceed? He looked at the display wall. At the Antietam, still at 800 kilometers, still holding, still dark in all the ways it had been dark from the beginning, except for the running lights and the transponder, and the hum of the unknown system. At the network of lights across the composite map, 40 years of patient building made visible all at once, present and integrated, and woven through the Council's own infrastructure, with a thoroughness that the authorization of force did not change, because authorization of force was a response to a threat, and what was out there was not exactly a threat. It was a fact. Facts are not addressed by authorization. They are addressed by adjustment. Yeah, he said. One word. He looked at the display. Don't, he said. The authorization signal transmitted to the hegemony intercept ships. Their weapons moved from active standby to targeting lock. The display wall registered the energy signature shift with the precision of sensors that could read the difference between a charged weapon and a weapon aimed. And what they were reading now was a weapon aimed. 3 of them, trained on the Antietam at 300 kilometers distance. The Antietam did not respond. It did not maneuver, did not power its own weapons, which would have been, at this range, the logical survival response. The thing any ship's crew would do when weapons were locked on. Did not transmit a warning or a threat. Did not attempt to break away. Did nothing that could be classified as combat behavior. What it did was hold its position and let the weapons lock come, because the crew aboard it had known the weapons lock was coming, and had decided it was coming, and had decided, before it came, that their answer to it was not combat. Their answer was the network. Every node, every relay, every quiet piece of infrastructure, integrated across 17 sectors of Council space, activated simultaneously. Not the gentle wake-up pulse from 3 days ago. That had been the opening statement, the proof that the network existed, and where it existed. This was the operational state. The live state. The state of something that is no longer presenting itself as a thing that could exist, but is existing, right now, actively, in the way that is already woven through everything around it so completely, that the question of stopping it has the same shape as the question of stopping the things it is woven through. The display wall went briefly white, with the volume of data trying to render simultaneously. When it resolved, the chamber could see what the network was doing in its active state. It was routing. It was relaying. It was doing what it had been built to do, the function it had always been capable of, the function it had been quietly ready to perform for years, the function it was now performing, because the moment that had been waiting for had arrived. Every supply route that ran through its nodes was now routing through them actively, visibly, in a way that was logged and traceable, and present in the operational records of the Council's own logistics systems. Not threatening, not aggressive, not a weapon of any kind. Infrastructure, being what infrastructure is. The chamber was silent for a long time. Kale sat with his coffee. He looked at the display. He let the silence be what it was, which was the sound of a room realizing that the frame it had been using to understand a situation had been too small for the situation from the beginning, and that the situation had been patient about this for 40 years, and was now simply visible. The Theric Combine delegate who was highest ranked among the 4, an older figure whose name Kale had known from files for years without having heard them speak, leaned forward and broke 9 years of open session silence. "What?" the delegate said, slowly and clearly. "Does humanity want from us?" Kale looked at them. He looked at all of them. He thought about the word want, and whether it was the right word for what the situation described, and he decided that it was close enough, and that close enough was what they had to work with tonight. "The seat you already owed us," he said. "A real one, with a real window." He said it to the room, and to the display wall, and to the lights on the composite map, all of them still active, all of them still humming. 40 years of quiet work, answering a question that had not been asked with enough honesty until now. He picked up his coffee. It had gone cold. He drank it. Some things you finish even after they've stopped being what you wanted them to be, because finishing is its own form of commitment, and commitment was the thing this whole room needed more practice with. The main display screen opened, and Elena Vasquez looked out of it, at the Galactic Council of 12 species and 1 human, in a corner seat, and the chamber understood in that first moment of seeing her that whatever they had been expecting was not this. What they had been expecting was something that fit the framework, a combatant, a negotiator, a commander making demands from a position of leverage, someone who needed something from them badly enough to have built an argument to get it. They had been expecting the posture of a person who has worked very hard to arrive at a position of power, and is now prepared to use that position in a way that makes its arrival worthwhile. What they got was Elena Vasquez, who had built 40 years of infrastructure into every gap in their supply chain, and was sitting in the command chair of the Antietam, looking like someone who had finished a very long piece of work, and was in the particular stillness that comes after completion. Not the stillness of rest, because she was not resting, but the stillness of a person who no longer has to carry the weight of something unfinished. She was older than Kale by 2 years, and looked it in a way that was geographic rather than diminishing, the kind of older that happens to people who spend their years somewhere real, doing things that leave marks. Her hair was shorter than he remembered. Her expression had the quality of someone who has made a great many difficult decisions, and is at peace with most of them, and is currently working on the remaining few. She looked at the chamber for a moment. She looked at it the way someone looks at a room when they are seeing it clearly for the first time, without the bias of familiarity, or the narrowing effect of years of accommodation. Then she said, "You have coffee over there? Real coffee?" Kale raised his cup. "Almost right," he said. "Someone made an effort." "Good for them," she said. "We've been running on compressed paste for 6 days. The crew is a little tense about it." The chamber was very still, with the particular stillness of people who have prepared for many possible opening statements, and not prepared for this one. Counselor Aelith said, with composure so practiced it had become its own form of armor, "Commander Vasquez." "The council." "I know what the council voted," Elena said. "I saw the targeting lock. We're still talking, which means someone decided to wait, which I appreciate." She looked at Aelith directly. "I'm not going to give you a list of demands. I'm not here to negotiate from a position of threat. I want to be very clear about that because I think the framework through which this situation is currently being understood is producing a misread, and the misread is going to create problems for everyone." She paused. "The network is infrastructure," she said. "Not a weapon, not a hostage, not leverage in the tactical sense. It is what I built it to be, which is integrated into your supply chains and communication corridors and transit systems, because that is where infrastructure belongs, in the places that need it, doing the work that needs doing. I didn't build it to threaten you with. I built it because I could see, 40 years ago, that it was what the sector needed, and I could also see that the framework was not going to allow it to be built through official channels, and so it was built through the other kind." Counselor Sath said, from the Prethian section, "The unofficial kind." "The patient kind," Elena said. The word patient carried something in her delivery, not pride exactly, something quieter and more settled. The word of someone who has inhabited a quality for so long it has stopped being an identity and become a simple description. Every piece of it is legally registered, every installation filed under the correct category codes, every flight plan submitted, every manifest clean. I did not break your laws. I worked within your laws until they had produced the outcome your laws were designed to prevent, and I did it quietly, because the alternative was loudly, and loudly would have produced a different council vote 40 years ago, and we would not be here. The chamber absorbed this. Kale watched the Theric Combine delegates. They were doing the thing they had been doing since they arrived in their green robes. listening with the quality of people who have already done a great deal of their thinking and are now in the phase of confirming what they have concluded. Their silence since the delegates' question about what humanity wanted had a different texture than their 9 years of institutional silence. This was the silence of people who have found what they were waiting for and are now present to it, fully, without the weight of the waiting. "I want to tell you something," Elena said. She was not looking at any particular delegate now. She was looking at the chamber as a whole, at the full room that was giving her the kind of attention that rooms give things they cannot categorize into familiar responses. 40 years ago, when I was a student who wanted to build transit infrastructure and ended up in the Kepler corridor instead, I had a conversation with someone I trusted about what humans were actually good at. The things people talk about when they talk about humans. The stubbornness, the violence, the way we don't stop when we should stop. Those things are real. But they're the visible surface. Underneath them is something that doesn't get talked about as much. She paused. "We are extraordinarily patient," she said, "when we believe in what we're building." The display wall was still showing the long-range composite, still showing the network, all of it active, all of it integrated, all of it doing the unremarkable daily work of infrastructure that has been in place long enough that the systems around it have built themselves to accommodate it. The composite map looked, Cale thought, like a nervous system laid over a body, not something added to the body, but something the body had already come to rely on, invisibly, in the way you rely on the things you have stopped noticing. "What I want from this council," Elena said, "is the conversation that should have happened 40 years ago. The one that doesn't start from the assumption that humanity is a variable, to be managed, rather than a participant to be engaged with. The one that acknowledges that what is currently true, the actual configuration of this sector's infrastructure, the actual degree to which human and council systems are integrated, is already the baseline, and that the question is not whether to allow it, but what to do, now that it is the case." She looked, for the first time since the screen had opened, directly at Cale's corner. He met her eyes across the 11 years, and the chamber, and the display wall, and all the things they had not said to each other, and all the things they had said once, and carried since. She did not say anything. She did not need to. Her expression said quietly, without requiring any particular interpretation, "We are still here, both of us. That counts for something." He lifted his coffee cup very slightly. She looked back at the chamber. Counselor Aelith said, after a pause that had the quality of someone collecting the resources to say the next difficult thing, "The council will need time to—" "Take whatever time you need," Elena said. "The network isn't going anywhere. The antetum isn't going anywhere. I have coffee now, because my supply officer found some at the back of the cargo bay that I didn't know about, so we're in better shape than we were an hour ago." She paused. "But I'll tell you this, Counselor. The Theric Combine has been running network nodes in their outer colonial transit lanes for 11 years without knowing that's what they were running. The Prethian Republic's deep space listening arrays have been routing through my infrastructure for 8 years. The hegemony's supply corridor to their outer installations is threaded through 17 of my relay nodes. This is not a situation that began today and can end today. It is a situation that has been developing for a very long time and is now simply visible, which is a different problem than the one your authorization vote was designed to address." She let that sit. "The question," she said, "is not whether to allow what is already the case. The question is what kind of relationship makes the existing situation into something that works well for everyone, rather than something that works because no one looked closely enough to understand what they were relying on." Counselor Sath said, "And if the council cannot reach the agreement you're describing?" Elena looked at him, not with threat, with the particular quality of someone who has done the calculation many times and knows the answer, and is about to share it because they were asked. "Then the existing situation continues," she said. "The network stays." "The integration stays. Your supply routes continue running through infrastructure you don't control, and the acknowledgement that you don't control it stays invisible, and everyone involved continues to pretend that the framework is describing the actual state of things when it isn't." She paused. "That's the alternative. It's been the alternative for 40 years. I am offering you the opportunity to replace it with something honest." The chamber was quiet. Cale looked at the display wall. He looked at the network and the 40 years and the patience that had built both, And he thought about the conversation at the end of a long night on a refueling station, and about the moment when a person who has understood something clearly finally sees it becoming real in the world around them. He thought it felt, specifically, like the moment when a card game that has been going on for a long time arrives at its final hand, and both players know who has won, and the question that remains is only how gracefully the ending will be acknowledged. He drank his coffee. Almost right. Getting there, Counselor Aelith said, after a long pause, in the tone that formal proceedings use when the direction is not yet decided, but the impossibility of not deciding has been registered. The Council will recess for extended deliberation. Commander Vasquez, we will transmit a formal response within 48 hours. Understood, Elena said. Her expression was still that settled, completed quality. Not triumph, not vindication. Something more like the relief of a person who has said the true thing out loud, and has been heard, and does not need to say it again. The screen closed. The chamber remained quiet for a moment longer than chambers usually remain quiet after a screen closes, because what had just been said required more time than usual to finish arriving. Cale set down his coffee. He looked at the composite map. He thought about 40 years. He thought about the kind of patience that is not the absence of urgency, but is urgency disciplined into something that can endure the time it takes to become effective. He thought about Elena on the bridge of the Antietam, with her recovered cargo bay coffee, and her crew, who had been running on paste for 6 days, and her infrastructure woven through 17 sectors of space, that nobody had known was infrastructure until she decided it was time for them to know. He thought she had done something that most people only plan. She had actually built it. He felt something he did not have a tidy name for, not pride, because pride implied ownership of something he had only witnessed, not built. Not awe, because awe keeps a distance that did not fit what he felt. Something more like the feeling of standing beside a very large true thing and understanding, for the first time completely, that it is what it is. The Theric Combine delegate who had broken 9 years of silence to ask the question earlier leaned toward their nearest colleague and said something in the Combine's internal language, quiet enough that Cale could not hear it. The colleague responded. The four of them exchanged another of those weighted looks that had been passing between them since the session began, and then the lead delegate looked across the chamber at Cale and said, in the trade language, clearly and directly, Ambassador Morrow, when the formal response is transmitted, what is the realistic outcome? Every other delegate in the chamber heard this question, and registered that it had been asked directly to the human in the corner seat. Cale thought about realistic. He thought about what the composite map was showing, and what the treaty working groups were going to find when they convened, and what the institutional resistance was going to feel like, and how long it was going to take, and whether the outcome was going to look like what either side had hoped for, or whether it was going to look like what outcomes usually look like, which is something in between that everyone has to keep working on. Real change, he said. Slow, with friction. Nothing like what anyone on either side of this table would design if they were building it from scratch. But real. He paused. The situation on that composite map is real. That's the anchor. Everything else has to accommodate the anchor. The Theric delegate nodded. It was a small gesture. It was the gesture of a being who has heard an honest answer and recognized it as such. Counselor Aelith called the formal recess. Cale finished his coffee. The treaty took 19 days. In those 19 days, Cale attended 14 working sessions and submitted 9 formal position papers and drank somewhere in the range of 40 cups of coffee that ranged from almost right to genuinely correct, depending on which staff member was handling the preparation setup and whether the supply in the council-level preparation room had been replenished from the beans that Elena had brought on the Antietam, and that had been, in a small and logistically improbable way, one of the first concrete contributions of the new Human Council partnership. He slept badly in the holding suite, which they had stopped calling a holding suite after the second day, and started calling a guest suite, a reclassification that required no formal motion, but was logged in the administrative record as a status change, which was how institutions made small adjustments to reality, without needing to explain what they were adjusting away from. The mattress was still too soft. He had stopped noticing. He thought about his mother often in those 19 days, more than he usually did, which was itself more than most people would call usual. She had been gone for 13 years. He had spoken at her service in the small function room of the building where she had lived for 30 years, and he had said something about patience, about the kind that is active rather than passive, that is discipline of timing rather than absence of feeling, that is the choice to wait for the correct moment rather than the first available one. He had said it and believed it, and then shipped to Vareth Station 3 weeks later and spent 11 years discovering, slowly, that believing something and knowing it in the bone are different achievements. He was pretty sure, in those 19 days, that he finally knew it in the bone. Elena came to the station on day 4. She came through the civilian bay on the lower ring. No ceremony. A bag that had clearly been on a ship for a long time and had accepted this as its nature. She sent Kale a message that said, in its entirety, Commissary, 30 minutes. He was there in 20. He had thought he would not know how to begin a conversation that had an 11-year gap in the middle of it, and it turned out not to matter because she had already gotten food when he arrived, and the food was the beginning of the conversation. The commissary on the lower ring used real grain-based bread, not the synthetic approximations that appeared on the council-level dining menus, but actual bread in the way that bread is actual when someone who cares about it has made it. The smell of it was so specific and correct that it stopped him for a moment in the entrance. She looked up from her tray. He sat down across from her. She slid a coffee cup toward him. He took it, drank it. "That's correct," he said. "I brought beans," she said. They ate. They talked about the bread first, the commissary's supplier, whether the grain formula had changed in recent years, whether the slightly stale quality that appeared 15 minutes after cutting was a storage issue or a formulation one. This conversation went on for the better part of an hour. It was specific and particular, and it contained no subtext about the treaty or the network or the council or the vote or 40 years of anything. It was the conversation about bread that two people who have not seen each other in 11 years need to have before they can have the conversations underneath it, and they had it with the full attention that it deserved. At some point the bread was gone, and the coffee was refilled, and the commissary around them had cycled through a shift change, and the conversation had settled into something quieter, without either of them marking the transition. "How are you doing?" Elena asked. It was the question under which all the other questions lived. He heard them all in the asking of it. How have 11 years in a corner seat treated you? How do you carry the Kepler corridor? How does it feel to be the one human in a room of 12 species making decisions about what humanity is allowed to be? How do you sleep? What do you eat? Who do you talk to? What does it cost to be the version of yourself that this situation has required? He thought about how to answer honestly, in a way that was complete, without being long. "Working on it," he said. She nodded. It was the complete answer, from her perspective. One of the things about her that he had always appreciated. She did not require elaboration as proof of sincerity. She took what was offered at the weight it was offered at, and she understood the weight. They sat for a moment. "The treaty's going to take longer than it should," she said. "Most things do," he said. "That's not a problem with the treaty. That's a fact about how change moves through institutions. You push, the institution pushes back, and the movement is slower than the pushing, and faster than the resistance, and somewhere in the middle you get the thing that actually happens." She looked at her coffee. "The network stays online." "Yes," he said. "It was non-negotiable in 3 separate working sessions. They tried each time from a different angle. It stayed non-negotiable each time." He paused. "They're calling it a goodwill gesture. In the treaty text, the human delegation's gesture of goodwill in acknowledging that the network is a shared resource." "It's not a goodwill gesture. I know that," he said. "So do they. We're using the words that allow the next step to be possible. That's what the working sessions are for. Not deciding the truth. The truth is already decided. The composite map is the truth. But finding the words that let everyone in the room take the next step, without requiring them to publicly abandon every position they've held for 40 years. She looked at him. "When did you get diplomatic?" "I have been diplomatic for 11 years, he said. "I have also been right for 11 years. Both things were true the whole time. It's just that the second one is becoming more comfortable to say out loud." She laughed. It was short and genuine, and slightly surprised at itself, the kind of laugh that happens when something lands without warning. He had not heard it in 11 years, and it sounded exactly as he remembered, which was one of those small verifications that you do not know you needed until you get it. They stayed in the commissary for another hour. At some point, the conversation moved toward Kepler, not deliberately, not with any particular intention to go there, but the way places you have both been come up in long conversations between people who have been in them. They did not go deeply into it. They went to the edge, and stood there for a moment, and acknowledged that it was part of the landscape, and then they came back, because going deeply into it was not what this meal was for. This meal was for bread and coffee, and the specific work of being two people who have known each other for a long time, and have been away from each other, and are finding out whether the knowing still fits. It fit. Not the same way it had fit before, because nothing fits the same way after 11 years, and two different kinds of hard work, and the distances both geographical and otherwise. But the fit was real. Before she left, she asked, "The seat, is it actually real? Or is it a better corner, with a window that faces the right way?" He thought about the treaty draft. He thought about the clauses that had been hardest to negotiate, the ones about voting rights on security matters, the ones that removed the advisory-only classification, the ones about the expansion corridor restrictions being replaced with a joint mapping framework that both sides would maintain. He thought about the Theric Combine's 4 delegates, and what their presence in the chamber had signaled about how the political landscape of the council had shifted in ways that the public record had not yet caught up with. He thought about realistic. "It's real," he said. "It won't feel like it at first, but it's real." Real things tend to feel uncertain at the start, because they're still being built. She looked at him for a moment, with the expression of someone who is assessing whether what they are hearing is optimism or truth, and has decided it is both, which is the best-case scenario. "Get better coffee for the sessions," she said. "You're going to be in a lot of sessions." "I have your beans," he said. "There's more in the cargo bay," she said. "I'll have someone bring them up." "Thank you," he said. She got up. She picked up her bag. She paused at the edge of the table and looked at him once more, with the tired, completed expression she had been carrying since she arrived, the expression of someone who has finished a thing they built for 40 years and is now in the space after the finishing, which is not empty, but is different from what was there before. "I'm glad it's you in there," she said, "in that room." He thought about what to say to that. He thought about 11 years, and the corner seat, and the bad angle, and the coffee that was never quite right, and what it had taken to stay in that room for that long, being what was required, without becoming less than what was real. "I'm glad it was you out there," he said, "doing what you did." She left. He sat for a while longer in the commissary that smelled like actual food, and the work of people going about necessary daily things, and then he got up and went back to the council level. The ratification session took place on day 19. All 12 delegations present. Full formal attendance. The main display wall running the long-range composite at standard daily resolution, not the emergency full display of the first days, not the crisis mode render, just the ordinary view. The sector going about its business with the network integrated into it as part of the ordinary. Kale's new seat was 5th from Councillor Alith's right hand. It was not in the corner. It was at the main table, in the part of the table from which you could see the display wall directly, without turning, without angling anything, without making small arrangements to compensate for a position designed not to matter. The window behind it was the right window. The view from it was the correct view. He sat in it for the first time and understood, sitting in it, that 10 meters of distance can carry more meaning than 10 meters usually does. The session began with the ratification. The treaty text was formally read into the record, the full text. All clauses, including the ones about voting rights and the framework revision, and the Joint Infrastructure Council, and the expansion corridor replacement, and the clause in the preamble that used the word partner for the first time in 40 years of council human formal documentation. He signed for humanity. His signature on a treaty document. He had rehearsed what he would feel at this moment, and had been incorrect in his rehearsal, because what he felt was not the clean emotional category that preparation tends to produce, but something more ordinary and more true, the feeling of having finished a long piece of work and being in the first moments of what comes after it, which always looks different from what you imagined, because the imagining was about the finishing, and the reality is about the continuing. He felt ready to continue. The procedural portion completed, and the first item of substantive new business was introduced, a joint resource redistribution framework, drafted collaboratively by the Prethian Republic and the Human Delegation's Preliminary Working Group. The working group had been convened before the treaty was even fully drafted, because Elena had sent a representative ahead on day 6, with a detailed draft, and the message that there was no reason to wait for the formalities to be complete before doing the work. The representative had been a young engineer named Owen, who had apparently spent most of the past 4 years doing the unglamorous logistical work of the network's maintenance, and who had shown up at the working group session with specifications so detailed that the Prethian delegation had initially assumed they were looking at documents from a much larger organization. They were. They just hadn't known it was as large as it was. The framework proposal was detailed and technical, and the kind of thing that reads, in any summary, as unremarkable. This was its purpose and its achievement. The most significant changes to how things work tend to arrive in the form of specifics, specific allocation, specific access provisions, specific maintenance responsibilities, the particular numbered clauses that define who does what when, which is where the real content of any relationship lives, rather than in the statements of principle that get read into the record first. He read through his copy while the proposal was being introduced. He read it as what it was, not advisory input, not a position paper submitted for consideration through the appropriate channel, but something he was going to have a vote on. His vote, counted equally, weighed in the record with the same formal weight as the votes of the Vareth Bloc and the Prethian delegation, and the Theric Combine. He thought about what that meant. He thought about his mother, and the card games, and the Tuesday nights, and what she had been demonstrating to him, over and over, with no commentary, that patience in its real form is not waiting without purpose, but waiting with total clarity about what you are waiting for, and why. And trust in the combination of preparation and time to produce the moment when the waiting can end and the doing can begin. He thought, the doing has begun. The proposal was opened for delegation comment. 6th from the Varath right was the first position called, then 5th, him, was 2nd, because the calling order was alphabetical by the formal treaty name, and humanity's formal treaty name began with the 5th letter in the Council's shared alphabet, which Cale thought Elena would find either amusing or appropriate, and probably both. He leaned forward. He spoke. Not a statement for consideration, not input to be weighed and filed. A position, specific and detailed, on the allocation provisions in sections 4 through 7 of the framework, including a counter-proposal on the maintenance responsibility language that Owen had actually drafted, and that Cale had read carefully enough to defend in the technical specifics, which he did, for approximately 9 minutes, in the clean, precise language of someone who has done their preparation and is comfortable with the detail. When he finished, Councillor Sath said, from the Prethian section, the human delegation's position on Section 5 will require further discussion. Agreed, Cale said. I'm available for the working session. He said it simply, as if working sessions were simply a thing he had been attending all along, which he had been, but not like this. The discussion continued. The vote on the framework as a whole was scheduled for the following session, leaving room for the amendments and counter-proposals to be worked through in the way that good frameworks are worked through, which is laboriously and imperfectly, and with the full weight of everyone involved, until the result is something that nobody got exactly what they wanted, and everyone can work with. He voted when the procedural items came to votes. He listened when others spoke. He took notes in the margins of his copy of the framework, and thought about Owen's maintenance language, and whether the Prethian counter-proposal on Section 7 was an opening position or a final one, and the texture of his thinking was the texture of someone who is engaged rather than present, which is a different texture entirely. After the session formally recessed, he sat for a moment in the 5th seat at the main table, with the correct window behind him. The display wall was at standard resolution. The composite map showed the sector. The network was in it, visible now in the daily operational data as a set of infrastructure nodes that were labeled correctly in the shared database for the first time. Not mining claims, not relay buoys, not research stations, but what they were, which was what they had always been. He looked at his coffee. He thought about sending Elena a message. He had been thinking about it since the commissary conversation, which had ended before he was ready for it to end, the way conversations that matter tend to do. He had been thinking about it through the working sessions and the treaty drafting, and the position papers, and the long nights of bad sleep on a too soft mattress, and he had not sent it because he had been waiting for the right moment. He thought, the right moment is not a fixed point in time. It is the moment when you have decided to move, and you move. He opened his message system. He wrote, Commissary, 30 minutes. I still have your beans, and the coffee from them is the best thing available on this station. He sent it. He looked at the display wall while he waited. The sector with its network and its corrected labels and its ongoing business, the 14 working sessions still ahead, and the framework amendments to negotiate, and the voting rights to exercise, and the long, imperfect, necessary work of making a real thing stay real, over time, which is always harder than making it real in the first place. Her reply came in 5 minutes. 20. He put down his coffee. He gathered his papers. He thought about his mother one more time, about the card games and what she had been teaching him, without saying she was teaching him anything, about the word she had never said to him directly, because she understood it was the kind of word that teaches itself. Patience. The real kind. The kind that is not the absence of urgency, but the discipline of matching the pace of the thing you are building. He thought, she would have found all of this excellent. She would have said so in the dry, precise way she said things that pleased her, without ceremony, as a statement of fact. She would have gone back to the game. She would have won. He stood up from the 5th seat at the main table. He thought about what he was walking toward. The commissary on the lower ring, and the bread that went slightly stale in 15 minutes, and the correct coffee, and Elena Vasquez, who had built 40 years of infrastructure into every gap in a structure that thought it contained her, and who was, it turned out, the thing the structure had been relying on without knowing it. He thought about what he was leaving behind, the corner seat with its bad angle and its advisory capacity, and its too long 11 years of being the human in the room, that the room was still deciding what to do with. He was leaving it. Not dramatically. It would still be there. It would probably be used for something. Nothing about an institutional seat change is dramatic in practice. But genuinely, the weight of it was staying there. He was going to the commissary. He walked to the door. The door opened onto a corridor that led to a station that now had a human at the council table, with a vote that counted, and a name in the treaty text, in a clause that used the word partner, without qualification. And outside the station in the dark was an antetum holding position, with a crew that deserved something better than compressed paste, and was about to get it. And beyond the antetum in the 17 sectors where the composite map had always been showing something that nobody had been reading correctly until now, the network was doing what it had been built to do. Quietly, consistently, in the way that good infrastructure does its work, which is without announcing itself, without requiring acknowledgement, simply being there, integrated and necessary, the way things are when they have been built to last. He walked down the corridor. He was not in a hurry. He was in the correct place for the moment he was in, moving at the correct speed, carrying what he needed to carry, and having put down what he was finished carrying. He thought about the coffee. He thought about it being right, finally, for the first time in 11 years in this building, the coffee being actually correct, and made from beans brought by someone who had built 40 years of something in the dark, and then turned the light on at exactly the moment the light needed to be turned on. Some things you keep because they remind you of where you came from. Some things you carry until you arrive, and then you set them down, and you pick up what is next. He picked up what was next. He walked through the door.